What Jesus told Clint Eastwood about churches wasn't a critique of doctrine, wasn't about theology or worship style or denominational differences, wasn't about politics or culture wars or any of the things that divide Christians into camps. It was simpler than that and more devastating. When Jesus appeared to Clint in a dream at 3 a.m. and said the words that would haunt him for months afterward, the indictment was so fundamental, so basic, so obvious once spoken, that Clint couldn't believe he'd missed it his entire life. Couldn't believe the entire Christian world had missed it, was missing it right now. Your churches, Jesus said, and there was sorrow in his voice that made Clint want to weep, have forgotten how to be the church. They've become very good at doing church, but they've forgotten how to be it. One deadly thing that was killing Christianity from the inside, while everyone congratulated themselves on their buildings and their programs and their growth strategies and their multimedia presentations. This is the story of what Jesus showed Clint Eastwood that night, and why it matters more than any sermon ever preached from any pulpit in any church building in the world. The dream began in a place Clint didn't recognize, but somehow knew. Clint Eastwood wasn't what you'd call a regular churchgoer. He believed, had prayed, had experienced spiritual moments that convinced him God was real. But church itself, the institution, the building, the Sunday morning routine had always felt somewhat optional to his faith, supplemental rather than essential. He'd attended various churches over his 94 years, had sat through services in small country chapels and massive megachurches, had heard passionate preachers and boring ones, had sung hymns and contemporary worship songs, had taken communion and been baptized and done all the things that Christians do, but he'd never felt particularly attached to any of it. Faith felt personal. Church felt social, like a club for believers. Nice to have, but not strictly necessary. The dream changed that understanding completely. It began in a space that was somehow both indoor and outdoor, a room without walls, a gathering place that felt ancient and timeless, and standing there waiting for him was someone Clint knew immediately was Jesus. Not because he looked like the paintings, he didn't, but because his presence was unmistakable, the way gravity is unmistakable, the way sunlight is unmistakable. Jesus looked at Clint with eyes that held centuries of compassion and centuries of disappointment. Not disappointment in Clint specifically, disappointment in something larger, something systemic. I need to show you something, Jesus said, something my followers have lost, something they've traded away without realizing they were trading it. Clint wanted to ask what, wanted to know immediately, but Jesus raised a hand. First, I need to ask you something. When you think of church, when you picture it in your mind, what do you see? The question seemed simple, but as Clint considered it, he realized his answer was revealing. He saw buildings, saw pews and stages and sound systems, saw parking lots and Sunday school rooms and fellowship halls, saw programs and schedules and announcements, saw pastors in pulpits and worship teams on platforms, saw committees and budgets and building campaigns. He saw the machinery of organized religion, the infrastructure, the institution. Jesus nodded slowly, as if Clint had confirmed something he'd suspected. That's what I was afraid you'd say. That's what most of them see now. The form without the essence, the container without the content, the performance without the presence. Let me show you what I see when I look at churches, Jesus said. The space around them shifted. Suddenly Clint was standing invisible in what he recognized as a large modern church. Sunday morning, the sanctuary was impressive. Massive screens on either side of the stage, professional lighting that could rival any concert venue, a band that sounded like they'd signed a record deal, production value through the roof. The place was packed. Thousands of people. The pastor was dynamic, funny, engaging. The sermon was well crafted, illustrated with video clips, backed by relevant statistics, applicable, practical, entertaining. From any objective measure, it was successful. Growing, thriving, alive. Look closer, Jesus said. Clint looked at the people, really looked, and he began to notice things he'd missed on first glance. The couple in the third row who sat 6 inches apart, not touching, wounded by something unspoken, The teenager in the back who checked his phone every 30 seconds, desperate for connection but finding none here. The elderly woman near the aisle who came alone, would leave alone, and no one would speak to her except the obligatory greeter at the door. The single mother struggling to keep her toddler quiet, feeling judged by the perfectly put-together family in front of her. The businessman in the expensive suit hiding a secret addiction he couldn't tell anyone because church people don't struggle like that. The young couple trying to conceive, surrounded by families with children, their empty arms a constant reminder of their apparent inadequacy. They come here, Jesus said quietly, seeking community, seeking connection, seeking to be known and loved and seen. And what do they get? A show, a well-produced, professionally executed show. They sing the songs, they hear the message, they drop their money in the offering, and they leave exactly as alone as they came. Clint felt something twist in his chest. But the sermon was good, the music was excellent, the production was perfect. Jesus interrupted. That's the problem. They've perfected the performance. They've mastered the show. They've built an incredible experience, but they've lost what I actually started, what I actually intended, what I actually died for. The scene shifted again. Now they were in a different church, smaller, traditional, the opposite of the first. This church was old, historic, beautiful stained glass, ornate architecture. The liturgy was ancient. The hymns were sung from hymnals. The pastor wore robes. Everything was done with dignity and reverence and tradition. The congregation was older, faithful. Many had attended this church for decades. There was a sense of history here, of continuity, of preservation. Look closer, Jesus said again. Clint looked, and he saw the same thing. Different packaging, but the same isolation. People who'd sat in these pews next to each other for years but didn't actually know each other, who followed the liturgy perfectly, but hadn't had a real conversation about their faith in months, who protected the traditions but had lost the life those traditions were supposed to serve. The woman who just lost her husband sat near the back. People nodded at her, offered brief condolences, but no one sat with her. No one asked how she was really doing. No one invited her to dinner. No one showed up at her house to sit with her in her grief. She performed the rituals alone, and she would go home alone. Different style, Jesus said. Same problem. They've preserved the forms, they've maintained the traditions, they've protected the institution, but they've lost the essence, the life, the thing that made it worth preserving in the first place. Clint was beginning to understand, but he needed to hear it said plainly. What is it? What's the one thing they're getting wrong? Jesus turned to face him fully. They've stopped being a family and started being an organization. They've stopped being a community and started being a service provider. They've stopped being a body and started being an audience. The words hung in the air like an indictment. In the beginning, Jesus continued, when I walked the earth and after I left, my followers understood something fundamental. They understood that the church wasn't a building or a service or a program. The church was them, the people, the community, the family. The scene shifted again, and Clint found himself witnessing something from 2,000 years ago. They were in a home, first century, Jerusalem, a group of believers gathered in someone's living space, maybe 20 people, no stage, no program, no pastor in the modern sense, just people sitting together, and they were doing something remarkable. One man was confessing a struggle with anger, not in a formal testimony, just honest conversation. And the others weren't judging. They were listening, sharing their own struggles, offering support. One older man put his hand on the struggling man's shoulder and prayed for him, right there, spontaneous, real. A widow was sharing her fear about money, and before she finished speaking, 3 people had already offered to help. One would bring food, another would check her roof, a third offered money without hesitation or pride. A young couple was navigating a conflict, and the older couples weren't offering cliches. They were sharing their own failures and lessons learned, being vulnerable about their own broken moments. Someone had brought bread, someone else had brought wine. They shared communion, not as a ritual, but as a meal. As family, they laughed, they cried, they prayed, they sang, not because it was on the schedule, but because it flowed naturally from being together. This, Jesus said, and his voice was thick with emotion, this is what I died for. This, not buildings, not programs, not services, this, people loving each other, really loving each other, knowing each other, bearing each other's burdens, sharing each other's joys, being a family. Clint watched in wonder. There was a power here, an authenticity, a reality that the modern churches, for all their production value and programming, couldn't touch. What happened? Clint asked. How did we get from this to what churches are now? Jesus sighed. Success, growth, organization, good intentions. They wanted to reach more people, so they built buildings. They wanted to teach more effectively, so they professionalized the teaching. They wanted better worship, so they created teams and rehearsals. And slowly, piece by piece, they traded the essence for the form. They traded intimacy for efficiency. They traded community for attendance. They traded being the church for doing church. But surely some churches still get it right, Clint asked. Jesus smiled sadly. Some. Yes, some. They meet in homes, in coffee shops, in parks, sometimes even in church buildings. The location doesn't matter. What matters is what they're doing. They've remembered that church is a verb, not a noun. Something you are, not somewhere you go. The scene shifted one more time. A modern living room. A dozen people gathered, similar to the ancient gathering but contemporary. Pizza boxes on the coffee table. Kids playing in the next room. Adults sitting in a circle. And they were doing it. Really doing it. One woman was crying, sharing about her marriage falling apart, and the others weren't offering platitudes. They were crying with her, committing to walk with her through it, setting up a schedule to check in daily, offering practical help with kids and meals and just presence. And man was confessing a relapse in his addiction, and instead of judgment, there was grace and accountability, and brothers committing to meet with him multiple times a week, to be available at 2 a.m. if he needed to call, to fight for his freedom with him. An elderly couple was sharing their loneliness, and the young families were already planning to include them in their lives, inviting them to birthday parties and holidays, treating them like the grandparents they were. This is church, Jesus said. This is what I designed. This is what the world needs. Not better programs, not bigger buildings, not more professional services. This, people loving people, really loving them, sacrificially, consistently, authentically. Clint felt something breaking open in his chest. Realization, conviction, understanding. The deadly thing churches are getting wrong, Jesus continued, is that they've become an event to attend rather than a family to belong to. They've become a service to consume rather than a community to live in. They've become a building to visit rather than a people to be. And the deadliest part, Jesus said, his voice grave, is what this costs. When church becomes a service instead of a family, Jesus explained, people leave when the service doesn't meet their needs. When it becomes a performance instead of participation, people become critics instead of contributors. When it becomes an organization instead of an organism, people become members instead of family. He gestured around at the invisible millions. Your world is more connected than ever and more lonely than ever. People are desperate for real community, for people who actually know them, who love them not for what they can contribute, but simply because they're family, who show up in crisis not because it's a program, but because it's what family does. And the church, my body, my family, my community should be that place, should be those people. But instead, we've become another vendor of religious goods and services, another option in the marketplace, another organization competing for attendance and attention and money. Jesus' voice dropped to almost a whisper, and people are dying of loneliness. Christians are dying of loneliness, sitting in churches surrounded by hundreds of people, and dying of loneliness because no one actually knows them. No one is actually doing life with them. No one would notice if they stopped showing up except that the attendance count would be lower. The weight of it crashed over Clint, the truth of it, the tragedy of it. So what do we do? Clint asked. How do we fix this? Jesus looked at him intently. You start being the church. You stop going to church and start being the church. You gather people in your home, at coffee shops, in parks, anywhere, and you do life together. really together. You share meals, you share struggles, you share resources, you share life. You don't need a building, you don't need a program, you don't need a professional worship team or a dynamic speaker. You need people who are committed to loving each other, to knowing each other, to serving each other, to being family. The early church didn't grow because they had great buildings or excellent programming. They grew because they loved each other in a way the world had never seen. They took care of widows and orphans. They shared everything they had with anyone who needed it. They met daily. They ate together. They prayed together. They lived life together. And the world looked at them and said, see how they love one another. Not see their excellent Sunday service. Not see their impressive building. See how they love one another. Jesus put his hand on Clint's shoulder. That's what's deadly wrong. Churches have optimized everything except love. They've professionalized everything except relationship. They've programmed everything except community. And in doing so, they've lost the one thing that made Christianity revolutionary. The one thing that changed the world. The one thing I died to create. Real, sacrificial, daily, family level love. The dream began to fade, but Jesus' final words burned into Clint's consciousness. Tell my people, stop trying to go to church. Start trying to be the church. The world is dying for it, and my people are dying without it. Clint woke with tears on his face. The dream had been more than a dream, more than a vision. It had been an encounter, a commission, a call. He understood now what had always felt wrong about church. The performance without presence, the programs without relationship, the organization without family, the service without sacrifice. He'd spent 94 years thinking church was optional, thinking it was just the place Christians gathered for an hour on Sunday. He'd been right that church as an organization was optional, but he'd been wrong about what church actually was church. The real thing, the thing Jesus died for, wasn't optional at all. It was essential, just not in the form most people were practicing it. Within a week, Clint had invited 10 people to his home, not for Bible study, not for a small group, just for dinner, for conversation, for life. He told them about the dream, about what Jesus had said, about what churches were getting wrong. And he watched as recognition dawned on their faces. They'd felt it too. The emptiness behind the excellent services, the loneliness in the crowded sanctuaries, the isolation in the organized programs. So what do we do? One of them asked. We be the church, Clint said. We love each other, really love each other. We share our lives. We share our resources. We share our struggles. We show up for each other, not when it's convenient, not when there's a program, but because we're family, because that's what Jesus died for. That's what the world needs. That's what we need. 3 months later, that group of 10 had become 3 groups of 12, not because they were trying to grow, but because when people encountered real community, real love, real family, they were desperate for it. They'd been looking for it their whole lives. They met in homes, they shared meals, they prayed for each other, they helped each other move, they showed up at hospitals, they walked through divorces and job losses and health crises together. They celebrated victories and mourned losses as family, and it was messy, harder than just attending a service, more demanding than just showing up on Sunday, more complicated than just being an audience member. But it was real, it was alive, it was what Jesus had shown him. It was the church, not the organization, not the building, not the program, not the service, the family, the community, the body, the people. The church being the church instead of just doing church. That's what had been deadly wrong. That's what Jesus had come to correct. That's what would change everything if Christians would hear it, believe it, and live it. Not another program, not another building, not another service. Just people loving people the way Jesus loved. Sacrificially, daily, completely. Being the church instead of going to church. That was the one thing. The deadly thing. The thing that mattered more than all the programs and buildings and services combined. And Clint at 94 had finally learned it. Not too late. Just in time to spend whatever years remained living it, being it, showing others how to be it. The church, not as institution, but as family. Not as organization, but as organism. Not as service, but as sacrifice, the way Jesus intended, the way he died for, the way that would change the world. Again, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for new stories.